Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Interdepartmental Task Team on the Recognition of Prior Learning in the Public Sectors seminar on strengthening the implementation of RPL. And then we will specifically focus on lessons, trends, and opportunities for the public sector. My name is Trudy van Wyk, and I'm the Chief Director in the Department of Higher Education and Training. And I want to welcome over 100 participants, co- uh, colleagues, friends, and participants. I am amazed by the number of people that have joined this seminar. It's a Friday afternoon. I wonder if you forgot that it's a Friday afternoon, but I really appreciate. We are over 100 participants already. 318 have registered, so I think a lot of people will still join us during the course of this afternoon. This is a very short seminar, and we intend to keep to the time because I know it's Friday afternoon. We all want to go home for the weekend. And I want to thank you for making yourself available on this Friday afternoon. The profile of our participants varies such a lot. Firstly, I want to recognize the Interdepartmental Task Team on the recognition of prior learning in the public sector. And this task team was established about 2, 3 years ago. And the members of the task team include representatives from the Departments of Basic Education, the Department of Higher Education and Training, the Department of Public Service and Administration, Science and Innovation, Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, COGTA, as we know it in South Africa, the National School of Government, the South African Qualifications Authority, and the three quality councils, namely Umalusi, the Council on Higher Education, or Council for Higher Education, and the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, as well as the South African Local Government Association, SALGA. These are the members, and we have extended the participation of this seminar to also members of these organizations and institutions. And in specific, I want to thank the South African Qualifications Authority and in specific Dr. Heidi Bolton, who were very instrumental in conceptualizing and in getting this seminar off the ground. But then I also want to acknowledge all the other participants from universities, from TVET colleges, from CET colleges, and from the Department of Higher Education and Training, and all the others. And in specific, I want to really highlight our CET colleges. That is our newest group of institutions in the Department of Higher Education and Training. And we've got several principals, deputy principals, and lecturers from our CET colleges here. And I in specific want to say welcome, because I know RPL is a very big task that you as a college sector also have. And then all the TVET college participants, I really want to acknowledge you also for the lecturers, the vice deputy principals, as well as the principals who are in attendance. It's really for us encouraging that the moment we start looking at RPL away from the theoretical aspects of RPL, and now we are where the tire hits the tar, where we need to implement RPL, and we can just learn from today. And we are very privileged to have such a group of participants around the globe today, and we are already at 143 participants. Really, I am so happy to see the number of people participating in this seminar. I just want to, as a brief introduction, to say that this is not a meeting. This is a seminar. So you as a participant will not be able to speak in this meeting. So you will be a participant, only the speakers and the moderator will be able to speak, but you will be able to post your questions either on the question and answer facility or on the chat facility. Colleagues, I must say, depending on your settings of your computer, you will have access to the question and answer facility of Microsoft Teams. But if you don't have, just post your questions on the chat. Especially in the second session today, please make sure that you direct the question to somebody specifically, either Professor Ray or Professor Aguiar. And the first session is only for Professor Mandell. So I would really appreciate if you can just say who you are posting your question to, and then also what your question is in writing. And that will also be then translated to the speaker, and he or she will answer your question. And if there are any questions, and I hope there are so many questions that we can't answer all the questions in the time available, we will ask the participants and the speakers to please answer the questions in writing, and then we will post the questions together with our video on YouTube. So you will have access on YouTube also to the recording of the seminar. So that is all that I want to say in the welcome, and I hope you are welcome. And I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Can we then ask then that we move to our next slide, and that is where I want to introduce, and I'm not going to introduce them, but just give you a spread of our three guest speakers today who are going to lead the discussion today. We're talking of Professor Alan Mandell, Professor Edilene Aguiar, and Professor Lana Ray. They will all join us online, and as I said, you can post questions to them. The purpose of this seminar is for me very important. The purpose is to promote awareness and understanding of RPL in the public sector, to share good practices and lessons learned from existing international RPL initiatives, and build the capacity of stakeholders, and that's all of us around the table, in implementing RPL in our perspective context. So without further ado, let us move to the program, and I will give a very short overview of the program. So I'm busy with the opening and the welcome, and then I will ask Ms. Nadia Starr, who is the Chief Executive Officer of SAQA, to introduce our first speaker. Directly after his presentation, we will have a discussion with him. Professor Mandell is unfortunately not available later on. You must remember this is very early for the US to wake up at the moment. So they are in Friday morning, and then we will have a discussion with Professor Mandell, and he will then leave the discussion. Then we will ask our next introduction, a person who introduced our speakers, and that is Ms. Mulwazi Gaza, to introduce Professor Aguiar. And directly after a presentation, we will go immediately to Ms. Tembisa Fushane, who is the Deputy Director General for Community Education and Training in the department, to introduce Professor Lana Ray. After that, Mr. Yapinel, our Senior Manager for Registration and Recognition at SAQA, is our moderator. And then your questions for the last two speakers will be answered, as well as you will pose questions to the different panelists. And then we will be closing our meeting for today. And I hope that it won't be, I don't expect that it will be much later than 5 or 10 past 4. So colleagues, I hope that we will participate in this meeting and in this seminar, and I hope that you will benefit from it all. So without further ado, I want to ask Ms. Nadia Starr to please introduce our first speaker.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, distinguished speakers and colleagues. My name is Nadia Starr. I represent SAQA, the South African Qualifications Authority, and I have the honor of welcoming you today to our online seminar on strengthening the implementation of RPL, Lessons, Trends, and Opportunities for the Public Sector. I also have the privilege of introducing our first speaker, Professor Alan Mandell, Distinguished Service Professor and Emeritus Professor at SUNY Empire State University in the USA. Prof. Mandell has spent decades serving as administrator, trailblazer, and director of the university's Mentoring Institute, driving a core value of access for all. Prof. Mandell is the co-editor of the Journal on Prior Learning Assessment, PLAO, which explores research, innovations, and best practices in recognizing prior knowledge and skills. He has authored and co-authored several books and essays, and he has led countless workshops on mentoring, adult education, experiential learning, prior learning assessment, and contemporary issues in higher education. The lengthy recognition of his work includes the Eugene Sullivan Award for Leadership, the Susan Turban Chair in Adult Learning and Mentoring, and in 2023, the Morris Keaton Award by the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning. Prof. Mandell's presentation today on prior learning assessment and RPL as a social movement, commitments, hopes, and challenges will both surface the value of prior learning assessment and RPL while critically reflecting on some of its challenges. Prof. Mandell, welcome. I hand over to you now with the most sincere appreciation of your time.
Well, thank you so much, Nadia. I really appreciate it. I thank everybody. I'm really honored to be with you today. I am terribly sorry that this is at such a distance. I thank Heidi Bolton for inviting me to participate in the workshop, and to Detupa Fontaine, and I know invisible others for making this workshop happening. I am very aware that I am only one person working in this area of interest. Excitingly, impressively, there are so many people like yourselves across the globe. Thank you so much for welcoming me today. I hope that what I have to say might be relevant to your ongoing work. I'm also very, very aware that our common work is occurring at a time of tensions and indeed war in our world. As I hope to express in a few minutes, I hope very much that our RPL, PLA work has relevance to that world. Making those connections is incredibly significant. We're all trying to make a difference. I think that is what keeps us going. I wanted to offer some background to my comments. I did start with my dear colleague, Nan Travers at Empire State, part of the State University of New York, an online journal called PLA Inside Out. And we did this because we were not aware of any other academic journal that solely devoted to the topic of the assessment of experiential learning, learning gained outside of the academy or of formal training. We very much have wanted to find a venue for research, reflection, and to contribute to the conversation about PLA, called RPL, PLA, VPL, RVA across the globe. And very importantly, we wanted to find a way to further legitimize PLA as a meaningful academic practice. We wanted to be able to have people understand PLA, RPL, as a scholarly activity. We now are lucky to have 5 editors, and in addition to Nan and myself, Ruud Duvekot of the Netherlands, Susan Forcell in Canada, and another colleague from our institution, Carl Burkhart from Empire State. We are excited right now, and I hope you'll find this of interest, that we're working on a special issue of our journal that will focus on the work of, quote, open recognition that was taken up at the EPIC conference in Paris this past fall. Another upcoming issue is on the theme of PLA as a strategic key to human resource and sustainable labor market development, and very, I hope, relevant to you, a further issue of PLA on Indigenous languages and knowledge. We hope you'll participate in plai.org. It's very much welcome to you. Two other quick contexts. From the very start of our work, we saw PLA-related activity really bursting across the globe, and that bursting has become only more evident, like 190 people participating in this meeting today. What began really as an experimenting practice by a handful of institutions in recognizing learning not gained in the academy has become a significant alternative available in many institutions and nations. It is just striking to me how often it appears in national and international policymaking documents. It's now on many people's agenda, like I see it is on yours. And as I see it, PLA should really be considered as a social movement dedicated to social, political, cultural, economic, and educational change. This commitment has never gone away. I hope that you will see in a current issue that we have been working on, dealing with PLA as a tool for change for refugees, stateless, and displaced people, the call for the recognition of experiential learning has become really a rallying cry for many. I know this has been part of the South African context for many, many years. This is so impressive. There is so much more that can be done. There's a second note that I wanted to make, context, which is something I think everybody in this room knows, that RPL has been geared to respond always to a world of educational, economic, social, and cultural inequality. As a social movement, it has recognized and tried to respond to deep unfairnesses and alienation that permeate so much of the social life around the world today. In the first half of the 50-year period during which PLA took off, beginning in the 1970s, and now in the second 25-year period, PLA has always served as a tool for social redress and has been highlighted time and again for that goal. It is a powerful tool for change. In fact, I think the abiding question that spur all of us in the PLA movement are, given all of the impressive work that so many people have done, in what ways are we truly contributing to meaningful social change? Can our RPL commitments continue to respond to entrenched social structures and ways of life that continue to reproduce injustices and inequality? What has been done? What is to be done? How can we move forward? What is our RPL agenda? How is it linked to other agendas for social change? Given this context, I wanted to focus on one dimension of our PLA practices, our efforts to implement RPL, that I worry sometimes get neglected. Yes, there are more individuals and groups at the local, national, and international levels taking PLA seriously and including the recognition of prior learning in policy deliberations. And yes, there are rules, processes, and systems being created and carried out, ones now using new technologies that didn't exist in 1980. No doubt these policies and processes, networks, agreements, efforts to implement have been made and will continue to be made and make an enormous difference, I think, in people's lives. We desperately need them and need to support this policy work at every level. It's a sign of our success. It's a sign of our movement for change. At the same time, and this is what I hope to contribute today, we have to ask another crucial question. Have we paid sufficient attention to the ideas, the values, and ethical underpinnings that support these systems? Have our policies and plans and fantasies weighed us down and deflected attention sometimes from the evaluative criteria that are needed to guide our work? Put in another way, based on what ideas and what values can we critically evaluate what we are doing in the PLA sphere? We know that none of our work is neutral, and it's thus our responsibility to pause, to identify, to describe, to meet the values that inspire and that pull us together and sustain our commitment to PLA. This kind of painstaking work reflects our own commitment to deep critical reflection that, as I see it, mirrors what we are telling our students that RPL is all about. Indeed, if we are asking our students to reflect and to critically reflect, we have to do the same. I would like to name 5 of these cherished ideas. I know my list is necessarily incomplete. Different contexts may call for the embracing of different core values. I want to invite all of us to dive into this dimension of our RPL work. Here are my 5. Our RPL work values inclusion. It rests on the assumption that too many institutions, whether of work or school or social life, are based on exclusion and on discriminatory practices that have left many people behind based on race and gender and ethnicity and class and age, thus often creating intractable hierarchies of unfairness that block people from living decent lives. As I mentioned earlier, these inequalities are everywhere. We thus have to ask ourselves, how do our PLA policies and practices actually continue to exclude, or more directly, might we think we are including while we continue tacitly, automatically to exclude? Second, our PLA work values the presence, the richness, the values and contributions of a multiplicity of voices, experiences, and understandings. It rests on the premise that too often we assume that particular ways of knowing are superior and that knowledge hierarchies are inevitable and necessary to support systems upon which we depend. We thus have to ask ourselves here, how do our RPL policies and practices embrace what Serge Rave in the Open Recognition Manifesto refers to as epistemic hegemony? Are we, without thinking about it, imposing our ideas about right language and right understanding and right knowing? Are we taking for granted definitions of expertise, for example, in our PLA policies and practices, and thus, against our claims to the contrary, legitimating forms of domination? Here again, we may not think we are doing that, but maybe we are. And here's a third PLA core value. Our PLA value, we value experimentation. It rests on the assumption that no model of evaluation, no process of assessment, no framework, no rubric, however beautiful we think it is, how wonderfully crafted it is, are etched in stone and freed from the necessity of ongoing critical scrutiny. How do we make sure that we call for thoughtful revision, including the importance of constructing PLA policy to respond to the particular context in which we work? How do our PLA policies and practices create tightly bound and inflexible systems of practice while proudly announcing our claims of clarity, transparency, and access? And how do these actually tie us in knots and paralyze any recasting of what we come to believe we must do in the way we have learned to do it? What are our clues to really being stuck? What can we do to continue to ask questions and experiment? And here's a fourth value. Our RPL work values, as I've used the word, recognition. It rests on the assumption that, as Axel Honneth articulates and Ted Fleming has described, many people in our world have damaged recognition and are thus engaged with their lives in what can be described as their own struggle for recognition. This is why the 2025 Paris Declaration refers to as recognition as a fundamental human practice. And here's the question that I want to ask. Could it be that our PLA policies and practices actually undercut the fullness of people's experiences and understandings, and instead create systems of assessment that treat them as objects and not as subjects? Are we actually failing to recognize individual autonomy and the value of what Ruud Duvakot describes as personalization and the personal standard? Are we? And here's my fifth point. Our RPL work values the goal of transformation. It rests on the assumption that the work we do as policy, procedure creators, evaluators, and RPL champions must create openings for the transformative power of RPL. How we need to ask ourselves, do our PLA policies and practices acknowledge the ways in which not only PLA outcomes, but PLA-related activities can be transformative for our students, workers, community members who are engaged in this process? And in addition, how can we open up possibilities for our work to be transformative for ourselves who have created and work in this domain? Could it be, we need to continue to ask ourselves, that we purposefully or inadvertently shut off opportunities for personal, professional, and institutional change? Do we fear the transformations that we all need to experience? What exactly are we afraid of? Might we, people who see ourselves as champions of change, actually fear that we could lose control? Yes, we are often quick to acknowledge our students' fear that changes in PLA open up for them. Could we be as fearful if we embrace change as a fundamental principle of all of our work? I am very aware that as a result of ongoing dialogue and debate that are so necessary for all of us who take part in this difficult, value-laden, and sometimes emotionally fraught work, there are other touchstone values, other cherished principles that will come to the surface. As I earlier mentioned, some of this reflection has to be context-specific, and thus what you in South Africa or even in a specific institution in South Africa embrace as your core values might be different from what other institutions in other places in the world with a different history might hold dear. Of course, too, because of their emotional resonance, to quickly invoke such terms as inclusion or experimentation or recognition or transformation does not suggest that we all agree on what these words actually mean. Part of our responsibility is to continue to evaluate and excavate those value statements and make our assumptions known. That is no simple task. It has to be ongoing. We have to be open to changing our own ways of thinking and thus our RPL processes and policies. I really hope that by focusing on these 5 values, inclusion, the embracing of a multiplicity of voices, experimentation, the centrality of recognition, and the transformative powers of PLA for all of us, we can begin this kind of conversation like you are a part of today. More aware, and this is really my big point, that even RPL, what we so hope can be a tool of transformation, can move in very different and sometimes highly problematic directions unless we remain aware of what we take for granted and why we're doing what we are doing. How important it is for us to evaluate regularly and critically what we are doing based on the ideas, values, and ethical tenets that serve as core principles that guide everything we do. We need to be incredibly vigilant. There are always forces working against us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President Mandell. Professor Mandell, I'm still sitting here and want to hear more. Thank you for your, I think, the passion number one in what you have for the work that you're doing, but also for me, the personal dimension that you laid as a value. I really I really think that is amazing. And the transformation part, look at all the hearts and the clap and the hands coming up from the audience. It's just hearts and clapping. Thanks a lot for your presentation, and thanks for the human side of it, because I think in the beginning you said that there's a big danger that we are so busy with systems and policies and those kind of things that we forget that there are human beings that we are working with. Thanks a million for your presentation. And
Thank you.
I hope there's a lot of questions that will come up. And I'm going to hand over to Mr. Detupa Fuchane. So he will raise, and you have spoken to him a lot, so you know him by now. He will raise some of the questions, and I still encourage our participants. Any questions, please pose it into the chat or in the question and answer section of Teams, so that we can then also interact with you for the next, what's it in the next 5 minutes. Thank you, Detupa.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Trudy, and thank you, Prof. Mandell, for your insightful presentation. I'm looking here in the chat facility. I do not see any questions specifically relating to what you have just presented, except that people are asking for the presentation, which Ms. Van Wyk has already addressed, that we will share the content of this seminar. That said, Prof, I've noticed that it seems that you use the words PLA and RPL interchangeably. I just want to find out if there are conceptual differences or similarities in the use of these two concepts. Thanks.
Sure. And thank you again, Detupa, for everything you did to make this possible. I really appreciate it. It is really, really astonishing to me how many different acronyms exist across the world, whether it is the recognition of prior learning, the validation of prior learning assessment. As far as I understand, although the policies regarding those terms could be quite different, there is not very significant difference in terms of what it refers to. I think, as I tried to say in my talk, I was very struck myself that in this EPIC meeting that I attended in Paris, the call for using the word in English, recognition, was so great. This was about recognition. And I think that there is a nuanced distinction about using recognition rather than, for example, validation, because recognition carries with it some sense of the wholeness of a person. The fact that we're not, I guess this is part of my thought about the transformation thing. We're not just developing a kind of new system or new instrument, but the system or the instrument has to be part of a larger value claim, and it has to do with personhood. It has to do with communityhood. It has to do with a recognition beyond just those tools. And maybe this is one of the points I hope I was making, and one of my fears. There are astonishing systems of VPL, RPL, PLA that have emerged, like extraordinary rubrics of evaluation. And I have two thoughts about it. Thought A, how wonderful that people are creating these mechanisms for evaluation. Point B, that we can get so infatuated with the systems and the instruments and the tools that they too can become instruments of control, and that we will lose some of the hope of, quote, recognition that RPL, VPL sought to achieve. Our infatuation with the systems is incredible. I'm sometimes just shocked by the number of rubrics that exists in the world and various qualifications. To what extent do we get carried away with them and lose the question of why we're doing what we're doing?
Thank you so much, Prof, for that comprehensive response. It really helps a lot in one, cementing one's understanding of the whole concept of RPL. So in the absence of any questions from the participants, I'm going to hand over to Trudy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ditupa. And now, Professor Mandell, I'm going to ask Mr. Yapi Nel, the Senior Manager, Registration and Recognition of the South African Qualifications Authority, to just have the moderator discussion with you. Yapi, thanks also for making your time available. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Trudy and Prof. Thanks again for an extremely interesting talk so far. And I think that there are certain things that we can pick up here, and I think that questions that we can ask ourselves also. And I think that what you indicate is that we need to change the thought of what is RPL really for. Is it only for the recognition of learning, or is what you say recognition of the person, and why you do that? So is RPL a control system or really a recognition system? But it's also now difficult to ask the questions, because you really provided some thought-provoking issues. But from a perspective of this webinar that we do have here, is that we need to look at within the public sector. So the question that I may ask you is that what are, in your view, the most significant global trends? And I think that you touched on some of those already, on the different ways that people, can I say, define it or mention that, but shaping the development and implementation for RPL system internationally. So just let me repeat, because I added some information there. In your view, what is the most significant global trends that is shaping or are shaping the development and implementation of RPL systems? Prof?
Thank you very much for a very, very difficult question. Let me see if I could answer this. I would have two thoughts about this. One is just very, very simple, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this. It is really striking to me how global the work in this sphere has become. A number of us participated in UNESCO training. Maybe people on this webinar also did. And we had people developing policies from Thailand, Korea, Mongolia, Kenya, Canada, Argentina. I mean, it was a really stunning thing to me to really imagine how this has grown to be worldwide. And it made me aware that the work in the US, of which I am aware, is minuscule compared to, for example, a European Union policy about RPL. That's imaginable 20 years ago. That things have moved to this level of providing, and maybe this is, Debbie, another part of my thought, the spirit of access is everywhere. When we worked on this issue having to do with RPL policy and refugees, it was really remarkable to me how many countries were developing policies in order to respond to the needs of refugee populations, displaced populations, stateless populations, who needed the recognitions, the credentials that RPL could offer. And I guess this is what I would say about the second point. In the earlier times of RPL, I think, certainly in the US, the work was really in the academic sphere. It had to do with helping students, more easily gain access to university, get credits toward degrees in university. The work of RPL in the workplace has become a much, much bigger factor, as I see it, than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly 30 years ago. Many people are seeing these opportunities as ways to recognize the skills, the knowledge, the understandings that people at work have, and that the lack of recognition has blocked them from any kind of mobility, access to certain jobs, whatever it is. So I would say another theme, one big theme, the globalization, another theme from the academic world to the world of the workplace, informal skills gained, formal skills gained, the way in which RPL can serve to provide opportunities for people for work that they had been cut out of entirely. Is that responsive to the question?
Prof, actually, I said yes, it is in a way, but you also opened up some other discussions, and I think that it's one of the other questions that I do have here also. And you mentioned, for example, that you say 20 years back it was mainly for access into higher education. And it is also very interesting that if I look at our higher education in South Africa, is that in some cases, yes, RPL is a need or they use RPL to access. But then many times and you mentioned also in the workplace and that understanding of the employers as well as other employees on the RPL for the workplace, not always there. Because I tend to think again still on I need to have formal qualification to be skilled or competent. And I think that this is also to build on that idea what you discussed there on recognizing the skills, knowledge, and understanding in the workplace, not to block mobility and progression of learners. Why it is? As I said that you mentioned that, but in your opinion, why is it more important? Why is it becoming more and more important to implement RPL, for example, in the public sector?
It's a terrific question. I guess I would, this might be a limited answer, but here's what I'm thinking in the moment. I think in a theoretical, kind of maybe an abstract way, the question that we are dealing with is, can we define a public good? What is a public good? How do we, at a time, and I guess this is the general context that I'm thinking about, in a time of fantastic strife, more recognition of inequality, how do we define a public good? And I think that part of this movement, and I do see it as a social movement, to social change is a recognition that our systems, whether academic or work, have not contributed to that to the extent that some of us hope or wish or imagine it has. So to that extent, the RPL movement for me is really, I don't know this if the right word, a reformist movement. It's saying the institutions that we have at work, at schools, have inadequately served people. And how can we find ways to more adequately respond to them and develop ways of thinking about what people know and what skills people have that have existed outside the private and public frameworks that we take for granted. It's really about, I guess I really think this deeply, it's about institutional change. It's about the recognition that schools and workplaces and systems of evaluation and credentialing that have existed have been inadequate. People have been left behind, and it is in our common public interest to recognize these things that have just not been recognized as they should be recognized. I hope that is responsive to what you're asking. I think this is, yeah. I guess I'm going to say one more thing about this topic. And it's this other side of things. I think what we are all here to think about is, what does human recognition mean in 2026? What does it mean to recognize people's lives, what they know, what they do, and to make to create a fairer world? And I think it's in the public interest, honestly, to be able to do that. Look what we are missing if we are not recognizing the fullness of what our populations can offer. And here's the side part. Sorry for a repeat on this one. My worry is that in doing that, we could be creating systems of credentialing that themselves can make it more difficult and can perpetuate hierarchies that I think we want to say we're against them. But could we be creating them? So this is why questions of like, who is an expert? Who has knowledge? How do we assume that we have knowledge? How do we assume that we should be making these, incredible rubrics? So it continues to raise these questions. What is a skill? What is knowledge? How does it get legitimated? Based on what? Doesn't answer those questions. It opens them up and makes them more explicit to us which I think is just a powerful aspect of the kind of undergirding radicalness of all of this RPL work.
Prof, I can see that you are really passionate about this also, and I think that what I get out of this is to say that the formal structures exclude some people from certain, can I say, privileges, and we need to be extremely careful that the RPL systems not contributing to that exclusion.
Exactly. And especially when we think we are doing the opposite, when we are thinking we're opening things up, and we have to continue to ask ourselves, hold on, are we also closing things off? And how can we continue to experiment with new ways of evaluating that open things up as wide as they can be?
Prof, thank you very much. I did get quite a lot from our discussion as well as from your presentation. I will hand back to Ms. Trudy. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jaapie. And Prof, I'm very tempted. There's just another question that was asked on the chat, and I want to ask you to answer it in 2 minutes, because I think it latch on with this last point that you say of the formal recognition. The person wrote, I work in short courses at the university. Many academics have a very fixed idea of qualification progression and struggle to associate experience with learning that can be equal and even greater to formal qualifications. What would be the first 2 things you would encourage to steer things to meaningful implementation of RPL?
Well, that's the simplest question, Trudy, I have ever heard in my life. I guess I'm aware of the time. I just want to say this in terms of that question. I do think that part of our challenge is to recognize our own fixed ideas. I think that term is great, important, because we have fixed ideas about what knowledge is, what skills are. And here is my answer. Many, many, many years ago, I was asked, what is the best way to convince the most belligerent academic that somebody has knowledge that that academic doesn't think the person has? Because that person rests on the distinction between expert and novice, or between knowledgeable and ignorant. And what is the answer? I think the answer is show that person the knowledge that that person has gained, that student, those skills. Let that student worker show that expert what he or she knows. And I would promise you that person will become maybe not a champion at the start, but someone who could say, whoa, I did not think that in that short course, that person could learn what that person learned. Show what those outcomes are. Show what that student has learned. Give evidence. And by the way, providing evidence, doing research in this arena is incredibly important. How can we show that somebody who learned in an alternative way through experiential learning has gained not the same, often more than somebody has gained in a more formal academic or training area? So I'd say the evidence, the experience, show it. The research makes such a big difference. What do students learn in that short course? Help people see that. It's evidence that supports our claim that this hierarchy of how people learn and what they learn is really thin.
Thank you, Prof. And wow, I would really say thank you for your contribution, and thank you for the passion that you have shared with us your ideas. And I think the biggest thing that I'm taking home from what you have said is that RPL is a human endeavor. We are working here with human bodies, with warm bodies, with people that care and people that experience and having things differently than me and you that were privileged enough to sit in a class in a university.
Great.
So thanks for your passion and thanks for your contribution and all the best with your traveling, because I know you're flying out now, and we
Yes.
wish you luck
Thank you so
also with
much.
your day, and thanks for
I'm
your
really
contribution.
so honored to be a part of this, and I hope everybody finds that the workshop is valuable. I'm always happy to try to answer questions as they emerge, so please let me know. Thanks a million.
Thanks a lot. And everybody's asked for your recording. So I think there's a lot of people that says, wow, this was fantastic. Thanks a million for
Super.
your contribution.
Thank you.
Okay,
Great pleasure.
goodbye and safe travels. Colleagues,
Thank
without further ado, I'm going to do the two presentations now. And I know both Prof. Aguiar as well as Prof. Ray is already on the platform.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, distinguished speakers, and colleagues. My name is Nola Zikasa, Deputy Director General, Planning, Policy and Strategy at the Department of Higher Education and Training. I have the honor of introducing Prof. Edilene Aguiar, who will present on scaling recognition of prior learning in Brazil, the SESI ecosystem. SESI can be translated as Social Service of Industry, a nationwide non-profit institution focused on improving the quality of life, education, and well-being of industrial workers, their families, and their communities. Professor Aguiar holds a PhD and a master's in education. She worked as a teacher for many years. She specializes in innovation of industry management processes, artificial intelligence in classroom, and innovative educational methodologies. Since 1986, she has been working in basic education at SESI as a specialist of basic education, responsible for youth and adult education nationally. Her work mainly focuses on the elaboration and implementation of recognition, validation, and accreditation methodology of youth and adult basic education as a foundation of lifelong learning. She is also an education manager and school principal in basic education, and she currently holds the position of specialist in adult education and basic education in the SESI network. Professor Aguiar, welcome. We are looking forward to your presentation on scaling recognition of prior learning in Brazil, the SESI ecosystem.
Hello everyone, my name is Edilene Aguiar and I work at SESI, Social Service of Industry in Brazil. Let me begin with a powerful number, 500,000. That's how many students have been impacted by SESI's recognition of prior learning system in Brazil. Today, I will take you through exactly how we activate this from the legislative foundation to the life-changing results. But first, let me paint the picture of why this was so urgently needed. These numbers reveal Brazil's education emergency. 31% of students never complete basic education, creating 10.3 million young people excluded from both education and work. The economic impact is staggering. Studies shows this educational gap costs Brazil billions in lost productivity annually. Face this challenge one organization stepped up with both scale and innovation. I'm talking about SESI. Created in 1946, we have grown to become Brazil's largest private education network, with 457 units across 27 states. We serve more than 110,000 youth and adult education students annually. But our greatest strength isn't just size, it's our presence in every Brazilian community. This extensive reach allowed us to build something truly revolutionary in our country. Our RPL network represents a fundamental shift in how we approach education for those left behind. Let me take you through exactly how we built this ecosystem and how we operate it in practice. It begins with partnerships. We have created what we call ecosystem of recognition that spans across Brazilian society. Our RPL network is built on strategic partnerships from the Ministry of Labor to prison system to military forces, Board of Education, and other institutions. But partnerships alone aren't enough. The real innovation lies in our methodology that based on three pillars that transformed how we recognize learning. First, we identify existing competencies. Second, we validate them by our knowledge recognition consoles. Third, we certify and build personalized study plans focused only on unmet competence. Let me talk you through each step. The journey begins with what we call the diagnostic step. This isn't a test, it's a conversation and fill up forms. Through organized interviews and portfolio analysis, we help students uncover competencies they didn't even know they had. A factory worker might demonstrate advanced project management skills. A community leader might show expertise in conflict resolution. We are not just assessing knowledge, we are discovering hiding potential. Next comes validation, and this is where we ensure quality and credibility. Each student's portfolio is reviewed by our knowledge recognition council, composed of teachers, industry experts, and community representatives. This isn't a rubber-step process, isn't a rigorous dialogue where students must demonstrate how the life experience map onto formal learning objectives. The consul doesn't just ask, what do you know? But how have you applied this knowledge in your real life? Here's where the magic happens. Based on the validated competencies, we create what we call personalized learning pathways. If a student has already mastered 60% of the mathematics curriculum through their work experience, they only study the remaining 40%. This isn't just efficient, it's respectful of the time and the prior learning. We are eliminating redundancy and focusing on genuine educational gaps. But learning doesn't just happen in classrooms. Our model recognizes three learning environments: the traditional classrooms, the workplace, and the community settings. A student might learn teamwork theory in class, practice it at the factory or job, and demonstrate the leadership in the community organization. All these spaces become legitimate learning environments. To support flexible approach, we developed 962 modular learning units. These aren't traditional textbooks. They are adaptable resources that can be combined in countless ways to match each student's personalized pathway. Create with inputs from 300 teachers. They represent the collective wisdom of Brazil's educational community. So, what is the fundamental shift? Traditional education says start from zero. Our RPL model says start from where you are. It's difference between treating students as empty vessels to be filled and recognize them as knowledge-bearing individuals whose experience have value. This isn't just educational methodology, it's a philosophy of human dignity. Now that you understand how our RPL system works, let me show you the technology that makes this possible at scale. First thing, the diagnostic assessment through portfolios and life stories. Second, validations by our knowledge recognition councils. Third, personalized study plans focus only on unmet competence. This isn't just educational, this is educational efficient. But how do you make this work at scale across a continent-sized country as Brazil? The answer lies on our digital ecosystem. We developed 100% SaaS platform that works even offline, crucial for remote communities. We added voice recording for non-literally students and gamification to boost engagement. This isn't technology for show, it's technology for access. Now, the most important question, does it actually work? The results exceed our widest expectations. 92% approval rate, 68% employment students for graduates, and perhaps most telling, 99.8% student satisfaction. But let me share what really matters. 966 of our students have passed assessments that give access to universities last year. That 966 lives transformed forever. So, what enabled this success? And what can others learn from our journey? 3 key factors. First, centralized governance, ensuring quality across 27 states. Second, strategic partnerships that create sustainable funding. Third, and most importantly, investing in our educators, because technology alone doesn't transform lives. People do. 3 factors crucials, which brings me to our final reflection. As Paulo Freire, our former education director, taught us, I move as an educator because first I move as a person. That philosophy is at the heart of everything we do. RPL isn't just about recognizing knowledge. It's about recognizing human dignity, potential, and the right to a second chance. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson, distinguished speakers and colleagues. My name is Tembisa Fuchane, Deputy Director General for Community Education and Training in the Department of Higher Education and Training. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Lana Ray. Professor Ray is an Associate Professor in the Health Disciplines, a Canada Research Chair in Resurgent Methodologies for Indigenous Health at Athabasca University, and the Director of the Anishinaabe-Kendasuan Institute at Lakehead University. She has been working in the field of Indigenous education for over 15 years in areas of indigenization, RPL, and quality assurance. Professor Ray's research agenda seeks to advance indigenous social, cultural, and political realities through resurgent and decolonial praxis, focus in the areas of health, systems change, education, and indigenous data sovereignty. In her presentation, Professor Ray will examine power dimension of RPL through a case study of RPL for Indigenous peoples in Canada. She will present a brief overview of RPL in a Canadian context, followed by an overview of dimensions of colonial power, which is applied as a framework to analyze the current status of RPL in Canada. She will then shift to a forward-focused approach, exploring opportunities for RPL in Indigenous contexts, including the congruencies between Indigenous knowledge systems and RPL, equivalences between community learning and post-secondary and institutional benefits of RPL. Overall, this presentation challenges participants to interrogate epistemistic privileges and power relations that may be present within their own RPL systems. Professor Ray, welcome. We are looking forward to listening to you.
Ojo, waskene gijiko kindigo jao kanoje nado dama paganis nadunjaba shuni and da. My name is Lana Ray. I'm an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Resurgent Methodologies for Indigenous Health at Athabasca University and the director of the Anishinaabe-Kindasuan Institute and Indigenous Governed Research Institute. What you heard was my traditional introduction to start. I'm also a proud Anishinaabe Kwe from the North Shores of Lake Superior. So what I've been asked to talk to you about today is the recognition of prior learning and its relationship with Indigenous knowledges. And I'll be drawing from my own experience and scholarship, as well as a project that I undertook with my colleague, Dr. Anita Valancourt, where we talked to different RPL practitioners working in Indigenous contexts across Canada. So just to begin, I'm going to set the context. Obviously, there's some differences between Canada and South Africa, but I feel like there's also some overlap as well. In Canada, so we are still a settler colonial state, meaning that we aren't in a post-colonial state. Colonialism is still ongoing, and it's more than just the extraction of resources. Our colonizers, the settler state, have set up home base here and have claims to be the legitimate title holders to Anishinaabe, to Indigenous lands. Within what's now referred to as Canada, there's over 600 First Nations, as well as Métis settlements and Inuit communities. And I've just included map for you here, and it just looks at the diversity of First Nations across Canada. And where I'm located is just south of the Hudson's Bay on the north shores of Lake Superior, and I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And although our territory expands beyond provinces, I'm located in the province of Ontario. Some more additional context. So a lot of the work in terms of indigenization or the inclusion of Indigenous education within post-secondary institutes has been driven or has in some cases had more support since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. So out of the 94 calls to actions, there were specific actions for more inclusion of Indigenous content within post-secondary education. And since then, it is also important to note that in 2017, the Indigenous Institutes Act came into legislation, and that allows for Indigenous institutes, so Indigenous governed education bodies, to also be accredited so that they could run and operate and offer degrees and grant degrees independent of colleges and universities. In terms of PLAR or RPL, PLAR-RPL was introduced in the 1970s within a Canadian context. However, it's important to note that despite RPL being around for quite some time within Canada, it still remains largely uncoordinated. And also some of the original efforts around PLAR were actually rooted within Indigenous institutes and within Indigenous contexts. So although it's largely uncoordinated, we do have a body. The acronym is CAPLA, which stands for Canadian Association for Prior Learning, which does provide some guidelines, as well as CCAN, which is Colleges and Institutes Canada, has come out with a national framework. You'll also see, though, differences at a provincial or a territorial level. For example, within the province of Ontario, within the qualifications framework set by the provincial ministry, it essentially says that other than specific types of apprenticeship certificates, that each institution is expected to set their own PLAR policy. And often what you will see in regard to PLAR policy is a requirement of a 25% or 50% residency requirement for content, meaning that 25 to 50% of your courses must actually be granted by the institution. So now that the context has been set, I wanted to talk a little bit about the theoretical frame that I employ in regards to PLAR. So as I mentioned, Canada is a settler colonial state, and there's an ongoing struggle for the recognition of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous rights for self-determination within education. Now, when we're thinking about dimensions of settler colonial power, there's a couple that I really wanted to point out. I believe they're very relevant in relation to PLAR and how PLAR can actually be a mechanism to disrupt, at least to some extent, some of this power. So firstly, we see in this framework the idea that there's an ideological justification for Indigenous dispossession and naturalizing settler authority. So we still in Canada, although progress has been made, see Indigenous knowledges viewed and treated as less than. And in most cases, Indigenous knowledges do not have recognition in their own merit, although, as I mentioned, things are changing with the implementation of accreditation powers within the Indigenous Institute framework. The other point I would like to draw your attention to is that there's often in dimensions of settler colonial power mechanisms for eliminating or transferring Indigenous nations and populations out of existence. So again, we still see predominantly in universities and in colleges content that is primarily driven by and taught by a Western worldview. The third point I want to draw your attention to is cultural appropriation, as well as the elimination of possible alternatives. So what we have seen is a trend in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to include more Indigenous content is for Indigenous content to be included, but that is largely out of the hands of Indigenous peoples. So we typically have white settler leaders and instructors within our programs who have full-time positions. And we'll see instances where Indigenous peoples are brought in for guest lectures or things like that. And also related to this point, many programs that we do have contain Indigenous cultural and community opportunities, but important to note, they are coordinated, i.e. controlled, by the university, and these are largely being accessed by settler students. So we have a large body of Indigenous students who possess community and cultural knowledge. However, there's no PLAR mechanisms in place in many institutions for that to be acknowledged. However, at the same time, we have experiences being coordinated, which are arguably much more superficial within Indigenous communities by a Western institution, and these students involved in these opportunities are actually recognized for that knowledge that they've gained through community experience. So overall, what we're seeing in Canada is the aims and goals of settler education are often conflated with Indigenous education. And that is really about and needs to be at the forefront about the vision and aspirations of First Nations. So jumping into why RPL as a potential strategy in terms of moving forward Indigenous knowledge systems within post-secondary education. So actually, when I looked at the foundational assumptions of RPL, although it's important to note that they're still distinct and separate from Indigenous knowledge systems, there are some congruencies. Firstly, the idea that learning can happen anywhere and at any time. And we see this acknowledged within our own Indigenous knowledge systems. And also connected to this is the concept of lifelong learning. So even our elders, our knowledge holders, they're very humble. And they'll often preface a statement with, "I only know a little bit," even though they know a whole lot. But that really is because of that context of humility and understanding that we're lifelong learners. And so we see that reflected, that concept of lifelong learning and reflecting on what we know and what we continue to know within PLAR. Secondly, the idea that knowledge can be derived from a variety of sources. So within Indigenous contexts, we understand knowledge to be derived from experience, from spirituality, as well as from other forms as well. So within PLAR, there's room and there's an acknowledgement for other ways of knowing, other ways of acquiring knowledge. Thirdly, that the value of holistic, interrelated, and relational learning is acknowledged. And although this isn't explicit in PLAR, through experiential learning in community, this actually creates space for this. So when you're engaging in experiential learning in Indigenous communities, there's place for holistic learning to emerge. And by that, I mean learning that goes beyond the intellectual to also include emotional and spiritual contexts as well. And for that to do that in a place-based setting too, and in relation to community. Next is the concept of student-centered learning. So in PLAR, I think, or RPL, it does a better job at meeting students where they're at. They're not required in 12 weeks to demonstrate particular outcomes. For some students, maybe it's 6 months of experience. For others, maybe a year to gain the knowledge they need to then demonstrate within an RPL process. And that better aligns with Indigenous concepts of mastery of learning, where it's really about not the time it takes, but focused and centered on the learner and what their needs are to achieve the outcomes. And lastly, valuing Indigenous knowledges. So such learning should be evaluated for credit. So RPL provides a space for Indigenous knowledges to actually be acknowledged and recognized, not just when they're funneled through an institution or access gained by an institution, but also for that informal, contextualized, natural community learning. Now, I mentioned myself and some colleagues had done some work in this area, and I'm only going to touch on a couple of the key points of our findings. But one of the things that we found is that there's plenty of opportunities for equivalency, and this is part of a model that was developed. So you see there's 3 areas here. One is in terms of kind of community participation and community building. And there's been some research done on this in the context of the Water is Life movement at Standing Rock in the US, where they were able to map and discuss some competencies that you learn in this community setting, community activism, community engagement, that are directly relevant to various degrees, cultural, language, and land-based knowledge. So we actually relied on some of these practicums or experiential learning processes for non-Indigenous students that I critiqued. But what these did was open up space to say, yeah, if they could do it and have this these skills and knowledges and competencies from community learning acknowledged, why can't they be acknowledged when, you know, we go to the root of the source? And then lastly, different kinds of volunteer, corporate, and other types of training. And so this leaves the door open, for example, like a community creates a MOOC, for example, educational units about the history of their community. So that could potentially be accredited or recognized through RPL. And this is just an example. So what you're seeing here is, this is an ethnobotany course that is offered within Ontario Canadian University. And then how we could see cultural knowledge, traditional knowledge, and traditional practices as a way to meet those learning outcomes. And in this example, we're seeing learning from birch bark basket making. So we're seeing things like describing the science of ethnobotany as applied in the understanding of relationships between plants and Indigenous traditional cultures. And one way that is expressed or that learning outcome can be achieved through experiential learning in community with elders or other knowledge holders is that by birch bark basket making, you're following Indigenous harvesting protocols, which deepens your understanding of and relationships with land. So I won't go through this in its entirety, but I'll leave this to permeate with you. So I just also want to touch on institutional benefits. So often what I find, at least in a Canadian context, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge is often framed as capacity building for Indigenous peoples or for the good specifically of Indigenous peoples. But it's important to note that Indigenous knowledges also have a lot to offer back to an institution and to society as a whole. And this is what this document is representing. So you see in terms of institutional benefits, of course, I think we've talked about this in some regard, is the benefits to the student. So all kinds of benefits, I think, can emerge for Indigenous students when you're able to offer them education that's relevant and set within their own community and local context. But then when we look at the middle piece, so in Canada, there's a movement towards experiential learning, often within strategic mandate agreements with the provinces, so with the educational authorities. It speaks to having to have so much experiential learning. And so within RPL and Indigenous context, it provides a way to offer experiential learning. And I think Indigenous knowledge systems and learning and RPL and Indigenous context also has a lot to offer and to move forward pedagogical innovation within the systems or within the frameworks of experiential learning and transformative learning. And last but not least, as I mentioned, due to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is a push towards indigenization within post-secondary institutions. And often our institutions say they want to do this work in a good way that is respectful of Indigenous knowledges and that acknowledges community expertise. So actually engaging in RPL provides an opportunity, a way to actually support more Indigenous self-determined approaches to Indigenous education and to really follow wise practices and how institutions should relate to Indigenous peoples as well as their knowledge systems. So with that, I wanted to say Chimi Gwich, thank you for your time today, and I'm here and welcoming any questions you may have.
Thank you, Professor Ray, and thank you, Professor Aguiar. Can you see all the hearts and all the clapping of hands that you are getting? And Professor Aguiar, when you were presenting also, I wish you could see the number of people reacting to you. And we really want to thank you for your contribution. We are going to ask that you put on your cameras now again, Dr. Ray, as well as Dr. Aguiar. And then I'm going to ask Mr. Yapi now to start off with some of the questions to be posed to you. And again, we encourage the participants, please put your questions in the chat. If we cannot get to your question, we will ask them to please answer them in writing. So Yapi, can I ask you to continue?
Thank you very much, Trudy. I think that there's also a very interesting question on the chat here, and that is to Professor Ray. But I don't see the other two people. There's Professor Ray and Professor Aguiar. Professor, while you are here, there's a question there to say, how do students admitted through PLAR to perform academically and professionally if tracked compared to non-Indigenous students?
Yeah, Miigwech for the question. So I will say there's, I guess, limited research with large sample sizes on this. But generally what we find is that students who are within, I've done some work in broader mobility work too, students in mobility settings where they come in with prior learning that's acknowledged in a variety of forms actually fare very well and often can be among the most successful students in the class. And there is some broader research that speaks to the benefits of RPL, both kind of a little bit within Indigenous context, some within the context of like broader marginalized populations as well. But it does speak to some of the benefits around retention for a variety of reasons, such as, you know, maybe when you're starting, you could have a reduced course load, or there's less financial burdens coming in as well. And then I think there's a part that others have spoke to as well around recognizing the whole learner. So that creates a different starting point or relationship with an institution when your prior knowledge is recognized, when you feel seen as a learner as well. But then obviously it becomes up to the institution to ensure that there is a consistent experience for the student. Because we do see that sometimes as well, where we often have Indigenous initiatives or student support offices who are could be a first point of contact, and that could sometimes be a different environment for the student than the broader institution. But yeah, I think it would be really great if we could have a more kind of fulsome study looking at the benefits, but what is out there, and also just speaking to a lot of administrators and educators in the context of RPL and hearing the experiences within their own institution, there's been demonstration that there are definitely some benefits.
Thank you for that answer. I must also compliment both of you on your presentations, and I think that there are some very interesting points that came out. And one that I picked up from Professor Aguiar is that recognizing human dignity and potential around that. And from Professor Rai, from your side, is to say that in applying the PLAR is that it should not go back to the system that you actually not want. If I say not want, I say that in quoted marks, because there are other ways of requiring knowledge. And I know that in South Africa, we start looking also at indigenous knowledge and how we can recognize that as part of outside the formal system. And I think that that is still a challenge around that. But I asked the same question to Professor Mandell on it seems that RPL and PLAR is becoming more and more important in identifying prior learning of students outside school system as well as in indigenous knowledge. But he provided quite a long answer, and I don't want to repeat what he said, is that it is important to recognize learning outside the formal system and to allow people to progress even in work. So the question is that, and I will ask both of you, so if you both of you can give me an answer around that, is that in your own view, why is RPL becoming increasingly important? And especially within the public sectors around the world, is that it is interesting that Brasilia on Brasilia on the one side, down south, and then Canada on the other side, up north. So from your perspective, how do you see that I will start Prof. Rai and then Prof. Aguiar.
Yeah, so
With that,
I agree.
so,
Oh, sorry,
sorry.
please go ahead first.
Go ahead.
Prof. Rai?
Okay. Yeah, I agree with what Professor Mandell had said earlier, and maybe just something else to add. I think for a variety of reasons, and most recently AI, but I guess the stronghold and the relevancy of the traditional education system is increasingly being challenged. Like, what is the relevancy of the system? And so within a Canadian context, right, there used to be a time where at the university you have an undergraduate degree, you know, you're going to have employment. And it's a bit different now. Having an undergraduate degree doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a career or a career in your field. So I think this is, yeah, challenging kind of the stronghold or of the university system. So in turn, universities have to be more responsive. So there's kind of that part that's going on. There's kind of more space being created for the recognition of other sources of knowledge. And then I explained in a Canadian context too, right? We have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as another component as well. And even within our province, what we're seeing, which I think is kind of related to the first point I made, is we're seeing, as I mentioned in my presentation, these strategic mandate agreements that are increasingly, I don't necessarily agree with this part, but are metric-based, that are directly tied to employment. So, and then in addition to that, we're also seeing workforce shortages in the healthcare field in particular. So looking at, are there different ways where we could recognize people for the learning, knowing that the traditional system in its traditional form has a lot of stoppage points for learners. So I think the need to address workforce shortages, more of that interrelationship we're seeing between education and the workforce and metrics, the broader kind of conversations are happening around responsibility and reconciliation to Indigenous peoples. And then lastly, I think we're seeing, people taking different career pathways that don't necessarily include a university, because there's been definitely a changing context in terms of the workforce. So to me, those all kind of work together to create an opportunity to further explore PAR or RPL.
Thank you for that. Prof. Aguiar?
Hi, everyone. Looking for Brazil and thinking about why RPL becoming increasingly important, I think it's essential globally for three urgent reasons. First, the social imperative. We have millions of young and adults excluded from education and formal work. And not because they don't have skills or competence, but because they don't have a legal credentials. Second, because the economic reality. In a world demanding lifelong learning and rapid rescaling, we can't afford to ignore the competence people already possess, even without go to school, because we can learn in life We can learn in another place, in another environment, as our colleagues already talked about, explained uh, uh, about these points. It is far more efficient to build on existing knowledge than to start from zero. Third point, it's about social cohesion and dignity. When governments validate what people have learning through work and life, they send a powerful message. Your experience matters. In a generation of inequality and dislocation, RPL as a tool for inclusion, productivity, and recognizing that hiding potential with our populations. And independent of if indigenous, if niggers or ethnics, it all left behind.
Thank you. It's quite interesting to listen to all of these. But there's again two questions. The one is, and I think that it is again directed to Prof. Ray. Is RPL the only route to recognize indigenous knowledge systems? How about an approach where all learning coexists in the same ecosystem without the need to formalize the indigenous knowledge systems? Prof. Ray?
Yeah, so how I usually describe RPL is an imperfect strategy. And I think when we're looking at the broader ecosystem, there still begs a question of who is designing the ecosystem, who is controlling the ecosystem, who is making decisions. And so I'm a strong advocate for the resurgence of our own governance systems and our own knowledge systems that are governed by our own people as an Anishinaabe person. But I also acknowledge that as that work is ongoing, we have many students who are going to school within a Western system. So there is a significant need to actually create culturally safer education spaces for Indigenous students. And we also see a gap where even within Indigenous organizations or generally within leadership positions, we see non-Anishinaabe people holding those leadership positions because of the academic credentials that they hold, even though our people may have years and years of experience. And so when we did interviews, this is something that there was a case where there was a program and they were able to exploit a policy they had to RPL people directly into a master's program. And as a result, within the territory, like a large number of the leaders at different organizations were Indigenous peoples who then had the credentials and were also being paid appropriately for the vast amount of knowledge that they have. So I think yes, there's space and there needs to be work outside of a Western institution, but we also need to acknowledge the current context that we live in, and those institutions still hold power. And I think RPL is an imperfect way for Indigenous folks to have a degree, have that recognition, but to do it in a way where they actually have relinquished some of the control and some of that learning can happen within very naturalized community contexts. So I don't know if that answered the question.
I'll see if there's a follow-up question on that one. But the next question is to Prof. Aguiar. And the question is, does this SESI modular program offer pathways to occupational or vocational as well as general education qualifications. Prof. Aguiar. If I can repeat the question, is does the SESI modular program of the pathways to occupational, and in South Africa is that we do have occupational qualifications, but basically technical or vocational qualifications, as well as general education and qualifications. Prof. Aguiar.
Okay. We have the same in Brazil. Our students come to do the RPL, and they have the knowledge recognized, and then we are able to create a pathway, a personalized pathway for each one. And then they can finish the basic education and also have a professional education. And then they have both certification and the end. Each one have their own trajectory, their own itinerary. Sorry, my English is not so good. But it's the way we work.
No, thank you. There's also another question if you look at the implementation of RPL, policymakers and institutions, from your perspective, is that what are some of the common misconceptions about RPL that still need to be addressed by policymakers and institutions? Prof. Ray, can I start again with you?
Sure,
Okay.
maybe I'll speak to two. Sorry, I don't know if you're saying Professor Ray or not.
No, Professor Ray. No, it seems that there's also a lag between Professor Ray and then Professor Aguiar. Prof. Ray? No, Prof. Ray, it's, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
How about if you ask a question to both of us, I will defer to my co-presenter and go second.
Okay. Prof. Aguiar?
All right. Could you ask the question again?
Yeah, the question is that if you look at the implementation or policymakers, is that what are the common misconceptions about RPL that still need to be addressed by policymakers and institutions?
I think the most damaging misconception is that RPL means lower standards. This is absolutely false. In our system, validation is a rigorous process conducted by knowledge recognition councils composed of teachers, industry experts, and community representatives. We don't just ask what you know, but how you have applied this knowledge in your real life. It's a dialogue, not a rubber stamp. A second misconception in that RPL is only for the marginalized people. In reality, RPL benefits everyone, from factory workers to military personnel to professionals seeking career change. It's a tool for lifelong learning across all sectors. Finally, some see RPL as a cheap second-class alternative. In Brazil, you have shown it can be a pathway to university and the high quality employment. It's not about shortcuts. It's about smart, respectful, and efficient education.
Thank you for that, Prof. Ray.
Yeah, I think for me, there's three main ones. My co-presenter did a great job at speaking to the misconception that RPL is seen as less than. So I won't comment on that anymore, but I think it's definitely an important barrier that needs to be addressed. The second one, which Professor Mandell talked about as well, is when you look at the history of RPL, it really came from kind of a social movement about thinking about access within Canada, actually within an Indigenous context, has a lot of its origins. But some of the conversations, as I talked about, have kind of shifted in terms of why we need our RPL. So I think it's a misconception to assume that if we implement an RPL process, that is automatically going to support access and that it's automatically steeped and operationalized within the principles of its origin. So we heard again Professor Mandell talk about, right, the technical aspects, the it's multiple steps to kind of get through. There's inconsistency in a Canadian context. Right, even for a Indigenous Anishinaabe student to have to take that step to advocate and say, I think my knowledge is worth it and here's how, because some of our institutions will have a coordinator position, but most won't. So it's sometimes off the side of someone's desk. There's not always very clear processes laid out. There's fees attached to it as well. So really, there has to be intentional system design to ensure those original principles and purposes of RPL is in place. And I think the third one is that process has to be held within colleges or universities. So I often hear too about lack of resources to support RPL, but yet every college, every institution, every university seems to want in-house their own RPL process, their own coordinator. But what would that look like if this is about community knowledge outside? What would it look like if there was, say, perhaps an external community governed or governed body and run organization to actually administer, coordinate, and do that work? So often it's just automatic. We're talking about RPL. Well, this is the route that we would have to implement it, but I think we need to have some challenge that and have some broader conversations about alternative structures for implementation.
I think that you mentioned there also quite a good or something good here. But before I get to that, I know that there was a question for Prof. Mandell, and it's using technology to do RPL. Is that, do you utilize or do you have a view around that? Prof. Ray, I'll start again with Prof. Aguiar. Is that, do you utilize technology also as part of recognizing prior learning? Prof. Aguiar?
Yes, you have been using technology to help us to go through our the whole country because our size. And then we have a platform, and this platform works online and offline. And our students can study in that platform and develop the knowledges and even fill up forms, have the contact with professors and the teachers. After that, they have the consoles on, and the platform has a ER, and this ER can make the trajectory and put the student where he wants to go, where he needs to go. This platform looks to our framework. We have a framework for everyone. It's about high school or elementary school. It's depend of the degree of the student needs to make, and then they stay there, they fill up the forms, we identify, we recognize the knowledge, and after that we can use the technology to help the professors and make possible the project stay across the continental size of Brazil dimension.
Thank you for that, Prof. Rai. Your response?
Yeah, there's examples of online portals, or a lot of post-secondary institutions use portfolios as a way for assessment, and those could be online as well. I would say I think employing technology is great when it actually supports access, but then also being mindful that there's times where it actually could be an additional barrier, depending on people's internet connections, depending on people's level of comfort. So, for example, one area, we have a lack of Indigenous language speakers. So perhaps there's language speakers who would use online technology, but it's not definitely like a necessary or prominent skill to be able to teach Indigenous languages. So if RPL, because of its technology base, then became a barrier to actually have recognition and grant degrees to have more language speakers, then that would be counterproductive. And then I guess just a comment on AI, we're having a lot of conversations about this within our context too, and within Indigenous contexts as well. So there's concerns around intellectual property. So we have ownership, control, access, possession, which are First Nations principles around data control and ownership. And so AI platforms often, if really ever, are OCAP compliant. And also, right, like the systems are only as good as what's being fed to them. And there's a lot of misinformation about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge systems, that so some of it isn't necessarily a helpful tool within Indigenous contexts, And when we're thinking about one of the strengths of RPL processes is really, I guess, the opportunity for it, the dimension of humanity and seeing the whole learner. So I think just evaluating how technology can maybe support relational people, places, people-centered approaches, so that kind of it doesn't lose that component of it.
Thank you very much for that. Prof. Aguiar, this is a question that I received also specifically for you. Could you please say more about the partners or partnership that support I don't know if you say SESI or SASI and the RPL network and the types of sources of sustainable funding. Prof. Aguiar?
Just a moment, please.
Do I need to repeat, Prof. Aguiar?
My internet is not so good, and then
Okay.
I can hear well. Sorry, it's breaking your voice.
Okay, the one question is that could you say a little bit more about partnerships with SESI? And the second one is that the types of funding or sources for sustainable funding. Okay, it seems that it's breaking up from your side. Well, yeah, I think that what's important is how do you fund your program or your RPL program?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Okay, can I think that
I'm so sorry.
No, it's I think that as Trudy indicated, that the questions will be also in the question and answer, and it will be forwarded to each and every one to make some comments around that. But Prof. Ray indicated there to say that if you look at RPL, is that should it be within the institution, for example, or can the community also assist and administer RPL? And I think that's one thing that people need to keep in mind, is who is doing the RPL. And I think that coming back to what you mentioned there is that your RPL will fail if you create the same elitist structure. Maybe that is part of that, to say that the community should be part in that, not to recreate that structure again. I think that is just so I see that time is running out and people will tell me that they, as Trudy indicated, it's a Friday. But do you have something to tell the people on the platform here, is that how can they strengthen the implementation of RPL? Prof. Ray, I will start with you. Do you have any comments on how to strengthen the implementation of RPL?
I won't pretend that I know your context and how to best do things within your own context, but maybe what I will say is that I've always found working collaboratively in partnership has always led to better outcomes, strengthened work, more relevant outcomes as well. So yeah, and maybe just thinking about that idea of community control and thinking about it on a spectrum. So everywhere from, right, building up community infrastructure that's governed by community within community. And then as we're looking within institutions as well, right, you could have resources that are co-developed that maybe help guide recognition and assessment. That might be kind of like a first step, or and then, right, you often see kind of advisory roles, but I think there's even room for partnership within institutional settings. And so one of my colleagues who does work around RPL for language instructors, Dr. Paul Cormier, he worked with community from the ground to identify what are your needs, what do you want. They identified about the need to develop something for this. They co-developed it, and they were able to plur people into language programs and then master's programs as well. And it was actually the community who decided admission. So it was kind of a 2-for-1 in terms of an RPL and an admission process. And the reasoning was, he was like, these are the communities that these people are going to be teaching in. So the communities are, of course, going to do their due diligence. This is who's teaching their children. So in terms of thinking about rigor and accountability, that relational context, I think, is utilized or under-recognized dimension of quality assurance. So those are just some examples of, maybe not saying this is what I would do, but a framework of thinking about partnership and control along a spectrum, and seeing maybe where you're at along that spectrum.
Thank you very much for that. Prof. Aguiar?
Can you hear me?
Clearly?
Yeah. I was thinking about that, and the first point, the strong legislative foundation is a tool to make things work well. In Brazil, our RPL systems is based in the national education law that we call LDB, which explicitly recognizes knowledge acquired through informal means. It's the means point. This provides legitimacy and sustainability. Second, build an ecosystem, not just a program. Our success comes from the strategic partnerships across the government, the industry, and the community. From the Ministry of Labor, prison system, militaries, educational system. No single institution can do this alone. Third, and most important, invest in our people. If our teachers don't be prepared to do our RPL, we can't do anything. Technology and system are important, but educators and assessors are the heart of RPL. They need training to become a facilitator of recognition, not just gatekeepers of knowledge. They start with a clear legal base, building broad partnerships, and empower the human element. It's what I can say in this moment, and what we think and what we are doing to make effective.
No, thank you very much, Prof. Aguiar, Prof. Rai. I think that we can still go on and on and on and have some more discussions around this. And I don't know, Rudy, are you still on the call?
Yes, Yapi, I'm still here, and thank you also for moderating this session. Colleagues, that brings us to the end. I wish we can go on and on and on because the discussions are so powerful. So I really would like us to keep our momentum also in RPL in South Africa. And I want to close this session by firstly thanking our distinguished speakers, Professor Mandell, Professor Ray, as well as Professor Aguiar. Colleagues, you were just amazing in the sharing of what you give and what you experience. And while I was listening, it was for me so wonderful to see the commonalities in two countries that are worlds apart. And I really want to say thank you for your contribution. It was invaluable, and I'm going to stretch our asking from you even further and say, can we please send you some of the questions to answer because people have asked such beautiful questions, and I know our technology let us down earlier in the session, but thanks, most of the people returned to the platform. So I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for your contribution, for your honesty, and for your passion that you have presented and answer questions. But also allow me to thank people who have introduced our speakers. You know, our seniors in the department are very busy and have got so many things to do, but they made time for us. So I firstly want to thank Ms. Nadia Starr, who is the Chief Executive Officer of SAQA. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. James Kiwi, that's in our audience, who is the SAQA board chairperson. And I think that is for me so encouraging that there are really our senior leaders are attending such a seminar. But also our two deputy directors general, Ms. Nwazi Gaza and Ms. Tembesa Fuchani. Thanks for making time available to come and speak to us and introduce our speakers. And then, Mr. Yapinel, thanks also for your sincere and a way that you have managed this moderation and the challenges we have, how you worked around that. Mr. Yapinel is the senior manager at SAQA, and he really did an excellent job. But then in the same vein, I want to thank Dr. Heidi Bolton. She's the chief researcher at SAQA for developing the program, for proposing the wonderful speakers for this presentation, for this seminar, and for doing the initial contact with them. Heidi, you were amazing, and really, I think you are. There's such a lot of value in the work that you're doing. Then I also want to thank Mr. Dutupa Fotane, as well as Ms. Nandi Maraba, who are working in the NQF Directorate in our department. Thank you also for the working, for the logistics, for phoning, for arranging. I know it's a huge job. And then our technical team. Colleagues, our technical team are people who has got day jobs, and it's not their day job to do technical support, but I think they did an excellent job this afternoon. And I want to congratulate them also on the crisis management that you've done. So Mr. Randall Foreman, Ms. Gerda Venter, Gina Umich, Sepu Lebona, Karabu Monsu, to who handled the platform, who handled yes, I think they need a hand clap for that one, because they did exceptionally well. And then for my fellow RPL task team members, thanks also for attending this. And I hope we also found this to be valuable for our work that we're doing. We will upload this full presentation and discussion on YouTube, and we will send you the link as well as the evaluation form. that we will kindly ask you to evaluate for us. And I see there's a hand of Beauty, and I miss now your surname because your name. But I don't know if you can speak. I doubt it if you can speak. Can we see if you can speak? I doubt it. Gerda, is it possible that you can just activate her that she can speak? Seppo? There was a hand from Beauty, and I missed the surname. Beauty Mugosi. Yes, Gerda?
Trudy, we don't see the hand now. It's gone.
Okay, so you wanted to say something. We will find out what you wanted to say. Colleagues, by that, I want to say thank you for your time and thank you for getting up very early in the morning for the people from the other side of the world, from the cold side of the world. We are in heat waves here in Cape Town. We had 40 degrees centigrade this week, so it was hot. It's hot in South Africa. And I hope that one day I will meet you in person because I think it was very valuable. And thanks for your time. Thanks for getting up very early and still having a whole day. We can go off now and we are off for the weekend. So thanks to the presenters, thanks to the participants, and thanks to everybody who contribute. And we will do another seminar like this. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you, colleagues.